There are two ways to lose a by-election: by losing the vote and by losing control of the narrative afterwards. Labour have certainly managed to do both of those after losing the Gorton and Denton by-election to the Green Party candidate Hannah Spencer.
To people here in Gorton and Denton who feel left behind and isolated, I see you and I will fight for you. Because whilst our communities may sometimes be labelled in different ways, the thing everyone seems to have underestimated here, especially over the last few weeks, is how similar we all actually are.
Keir Starmer released a truly baffling statement to his MPs immediately afterwards, in which he went well beyond the standard disclaimers about midterm by-election losses and described the Greens as extremists.
The Greens on the left with their politics of getting out of NATO in the middle of the conflict with Ukraine, of legalising all drugs, including heroin and crack cocaine, to give to adults. They are the extremes in politics.
Left-wing critics of the Prime Minister, of course, wasted no time in pointing out that had the Reform candidate won, there would be little time wasted in professing a need to listen and learn to the usual litany of complaints over migration and asylum. Not that, of course, that has stopped Shabana Mahmood, the hardline Home Secretary, doing so regardless.
Restoring order and control at our border is not a betrayal of Labour values. It is the necessary condition for a Labour government to achieve anything it hopes to.
Whatever your stance on the government, critical, sympathetic, repulsed, weary, it's hard to deny its serial ineptitude. And I think for anyone with even vaguely progressive inclinations, it's hard to feel anything but a kind of heart-sinking misery when it comes to contemplating the Labour Party. And we can think about why that might be, whether it's the party oligarchy or the kind of people it selects to be MPs, whether it's the difficulty of governing the country or the serial duplicity of the leadership, or perhaps its endlessly relaunched plans and programmes and so on and so on. Of course, in the past week, its inability to stake a clear position on Trump's war on Iran and the genuinely shocking leak from the National Security Council that exposed some of the divisions at the top of the government over this question, that's doubtless a significant part of it. The temptation to partisan or factional thinking here is very strong. A poor result for Labour demonstrates why I'm right about politics, and so on. There's been a lot of that analysis in the course of the past week. The answers, in fact, might not always be flattering to critics of the leadership either. Still, the strange and undeniably central fact is this: a Prime Minister who won an overwhelming landslide a year and a half ago looks completely doomed. Is he? Is he just the latest victim of a Britain completely rent by contradictions and thus ungovernable? Or are there specific problems within the Labour Party, and is the Damoclean sword dangling over Keir Starmer's head bound to plunge after the May elections? You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. I am James Butler, and joining me to talk about all this mess is Sienna Rodgers, deputy editor of The House magazine, where she's recently published extremely interesting interviews with Zach Polanski and Danny Kruger, not at the same time, though that would doubtless be extremely interesting. Formerly also editor at Labour List, Sienna's reporting has always been consistently illuminating for readers and pleasingly annoying to those in power. Also joining me is Jeremy Gilbert, Professor of Cultural and Political Theory at the University of East London and Stakhanovite podcaster at the helm of the Culture Power Politics Seminar podcast series, ACFM, the home of the Weird Left on Novara Media, and Love is the Message, a podcast exploring music and social change. A long-standing left pluralist and long-suffering member of the Labour left, Jeremy is always consistently interesting and insightful on the party and its fraught relationship to the country it thinks it ought to govern. Welcome both. I am going to start by asking you, Sienna, we've had a lot of post-mortems after the Gorton and Denton by-election. Lots of the reaction of the party seems to have been characterised a bit by sort of panic. Some people have said it's really overreacted to the by-election, and it's certainly true that by-elections, rarely go well for sitting governments. Is there also a case that perhaps they've underreacted?
It's an interesting one. I mean, you mentioned the Prime Minister sent that email to MPs reacting to the by-election after the result, and I did think that that was a very emotional response from Starmer. There was no strategic thought there. It really, I think that was one of those moments where we see the real Keir, and he does feel incredibly frustrated that for him, it is about, obviously people on the left on Twitter kind of mock this all the time of just this whole get the adults back in the room, you need the sensibles in charge and everything will be fine, which has obviously been proven to be wildly incorrect. And I think it was an expression of that. It was just, for him, Greens and Reform are two sides of the same coin. And when he talks about people resorting to voting for them, that's just an expression of grievance politics. And people in the Labour Party love to say that. And every time they do, I think, but people are feeling very aggrieved. So complaining about grievance politics doesn't really chime with the mood. And I think people were often saying before that by-election, defeat at the hands of the Greens would be worse for the Labour Party and a kind of a more emotional and devastating defeat than defeat at the hands of Reform. And I think that was absolutely proved right. The Labour response is, we must keep getting on with tackling the cost of living. Eventually, these good things we're doing are going to feed through, and people realise, these green shoots in the economy, although obviously Iran puts paid to some of that, but eventually people will see the good things we're doing, they'll have more employment rights, etc., etc. But I think that does miss the mood of the country.
And I think outside of the party, I think there is pretty much a consensus across press, across media, certainly for most of the people I speak to who only keep a sort of half an eye on politics, and it's always good to have those people in your life if you're a political obsessive, they all feel like he's doomed. Is that mood matched inside Number 10?
It's matched certainly across the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, it's very difficult to find a happy Labour MP at the moment. All of them have many, many reasons to be upset wherever they are on the spectrum. And yeah, most Labour kind of staffers and aides probably think the same. At the moment, if we're going kind of getting into the whole leadership question, at the moment, I'm probably more confident now than I have been at any time since last summer that Keir Starmer might survive the year, which is kind of weird in a way, but I think the worse things get for him electorally, the more perilous a position he's in. But the worse things get on the world stage, all these international events, the stronger the case is from the kind of Labour so-called moderate MPs, those who are sticking up for him, not out of any real sense of loyalty, but because they think that stability in the leadership is the right thing for various reasons. Their main argument is you can't possibly depose a sitting prime minister at a time when Trump is, acting so rashly. We've got all these various wars. And the one thing they say that Starmer is good at is handling these tricky characters and looking like, a proper authority on these things. So I actually think that at the moment, when there's all of that mess going on and the alternatives are flawed in so many ways that do matter to MPs, Keir Starmer's looking a bit stronger than you would have thought, considering the kind of Gorton and Denton result and considering what's going to happen in May. Now, I say that with the massive caveat of basically everything in Westminster, unfortunately, is very vibes-based. I know that sounds completely unserious, but it is a very unserious place. And if the mood shifts in the PLP, then all of that could change really quite quickly. And if someone emerges, I mean, there's no Andy Burnham at the moment, and that would have really changed this calculation. But if someone emerges as that kind of figure who doesn't have as much baggage and isn't too much on the Labour right, like Wes Streeting or like Angela Rayner, in terms of the baggage point, then that could change. At the moment, though, we're in a kind of deadlock.
Jeremy, what do you make of that? Overreaction, underreaction? Is he doomed?
I would say the reaction from the leadership has been an underreaction, really. I mean, the message that he sent out to MPs and members was, as Sienna said, it was accusing Reform and Green of both being sort of extremists, which he was going to steer a course between. But I think it's really worth taking note of the fact that's not a normal response from a party leader in response to a devastating by-election. The conventional response is you show some humility and you say, we're listening, we recognise there's a problem. And he didn't do that at all. But I think the question then is, well, what would be the reaction? Like, how could they react? Because ultimately we're in a situation where, you know, the obvious way to react to Gorton and Denton would be some fairly dramatic shift to the left. But if you were going to have a Labour Party or a government led from the left, it wouldn't be led by the people who are currently leading it. It just wouldn't be these people, and it wouldn't have this parliamentary party. So what do you do in that situation? It's not totally clear what the party can do collectively. I think on balance, I think it's most likely Keir will go this year, because I think everything Sienna said is true about the reasons why he could stay. But one of the problems with having such a big parliamentary party is, you know, you've out of 400 MPs, you've got to persuade like 320, a full 320, that they're not better off trying someone else, and that's going to be difficult for them, I think. I mean, that becomes difficult under the best of circumstances, because inevitably there's a lot of MPs by this point starting to realise they're never really going to benefit from the particular patronage network around Keir, so they start to think about what patronage they might get if they threw their lot in with someone else. So I think it is quite... I think the most likely of outcome of all the various possible relatively unlikely outcomes, I think, is still Angela Rayner becoming leader. But I mean, Sienna's right that there are all kinds of arguments telling against Angela Rayner. They don't, insofar as she does have all this baggage, insofar as any objective assessment of her record as deputy leader would have to say she's been entirely complicit with Starmer's project to an extent that ought to disqualify her. But most of the polls of party members haven't really suggested that that's really sunk in with the selectorate, that she's still popular with party members. She's popular with party members. The party is desperate for a woman leader. She has a good backstory. She can claim some successes in government, and she only has to get 80 MPs to nominate her. So I sort of think it's the case mathematically, as it really has been for the past 5 years, that if Angela Rayner decides she really wants it, she can get it. One of the major obstacles to her getting it over the past 5 years has been the fact she hasn't really wanted it, as far as anyone can tell, and for perfectly good reasons. Like, who wants this job right now? Who wants Keir Starmer's job right now? So that's the most likely outcome. But indeed, it's true that there isn't an obvious person who could play the role Andy Burnham could play. And I do think everything Sienna says about the PLP is true, and it's also true that most of them just aren't very bright, really. And I think a lot of them, I think it still hasn't really sunk in what's happening, and it won't fully sink in until May. Then I think the level of panic in May is going to be something to behold. And I think who knows what could happen then. I think, for example, you're probably going to see quite an unlikely groundswell of London MPs looking around for a more left-wing candidate, because they'll know that's the only thing that could save their seats. You know, the only thing that could save the seats of a lot of the London MPs now from the Greens would be someone like Clive Lewis becoming leader, which obviously isn't going to happen. But you can see a scenario in which that's going to be the kind of calculation some of them will be making in their fit of panic as London councils that have been Labour for 100 years turn Green. So I think we're going to be in this very unstable situation. But, you know, for all those reasons, plus all the reasons Sienna laid out, it's going to, you know, it's very hard to say what the actual outcome is going to be. And it might well be that indeed there is this sort of stalemate. I mean, the metaphor is like that episode of The Simpsons where we find out that Mr. Burns is kept alive by the fact that he's got so many different illnesses that they sort of balance each other out. It's, you know, Wes Streeting has become unelectable because of his association with Peter Mandelson. You know, Angela Rayner looks good on paper until any possible opponent starts pointing out to the Labour membership how totally complicit she's been with the entire Starmer project for the past 5 years. And you really start to wonder, what could happen? Of course, you know, maybe Ed Miliband is the person who will finally emerge from that as Prime Minister. There's just sort of the only person left standing. So sort of anything could happen. Or we could We could see somebody like Liu He, like somebody who at the moment nobody's talking about much, but who would be seen as a relatively safe pair of hands, but not Starmer and not mates with Mandelson by a lot of people.
Some people raise the possibility of her, but I think that there is still a sort of baggage question. But I think, I mean, there is also the Healy theory that I should give a shout out to, which is this idea that some ministers are floating, that they have to find someone, strong and stable, someone unifying and boring, basically, who will be okay in terms of the membership. They could accept someone like, the Defence Secretary and be okay with MPs as well. I mean, I think it's worth spelling out that in terms of the mechanism of this actually happening, of Starmer leaving, it's either 80 MPs get together and nominate a challenger and put that into the General Secretary, or probably more realistic, more likely, is a couple of cabinet ministers give him a tap on the shoulder and say it's your time to go, or at least you need to set a date for your departure to have some kind of smooth transition.
Yeah, historically, that's the way the Labour Party does it as well. Historically, the Labour Party doesn't do in-office leadership contests. Somebody tells the leader they have to go.
It's striking to me when people talk about Healy, of course, as a sort of boring and unifying figure. Those were virtues that were once raised in defence of Keir Starmer. He's boring. He wants politics to tread lightly on your life, and so on and so on. And it just, it opens up that question for me about whether people in the party really can accurately judge what is happening in the country and what is happening politically. In that those qualities which were argued in Starmer's favour certainly don't seem to have helped him very much in the role. I suppose there's a related question here, which is, that it was put to me quite despairingly by a sitting Labour MP who I won't name recently. We are actually doing good things. And, I think if you zoom out, if you were to take just a look at the measures, you say, OK, well, as you said, Sienna, there are some employment rights coming in. The minimum wage is at the highest it's ever been. That we've renationalised some parts of the railways. Great British Energy is going to happen. There's still a sort of vague net zero target, although it's sort of moving around and being pushed back. The Pride in Place strategy has just been launched. That's a sort of lots of money going to local government, local government in some places anyway. London, of course, missing out, but that's a consistent feature of this government. So actually, they will say, I think quite plausibly on their record, we're doing good things. But why isn't it working? Why does that sort of, move like water off a duck's back in terms of the electorate? Because, the ferocity of hatred for the government out there is really, really, really strong. Jem, what do you think?
Well, I wrote a whole article about this for the New Statesman in December, I think, that people can look at if they want to. And I think there's 2 points to make about it, really. One is just none of this stuff is really at a scale that's necessary to meet the sense of people's grievances, as Sienna was mentioning at the start, and the fact that it's quite clear that what people want is a really decisive break with really the past 50 years of Thatcherism and post-Thatcherite policy. And what they're offering isn't the kind of decisive rhetorical or programmatic break. They're offering incremental shifts away from it. It's true, and it's true that they are. So it's understandable it's frustrating. But as so often, there's a very close parallel with what the last Democratic presidency did here. Biden did the same. Biden had a policy agenda, which was, in these terms, it was the most radical since the 70s, insofar as it did mark a decisive shift away from neoliberalism and austerity and privatisation and anti-union legislation. But it just wasn't enough. It didn't feel like enough, and it didn't sound like enough, and it couldn't counteract people's huge anger at foreign policy in the Middle East. And we've got exactly the same situation here, that it's too little, it's too late, it's not going far enough, and it isn't accompanied by kind of rhetorical claim about what kind of Britain you're going to build, which is different from the one bequeathed to us by Thatcher and Blair and Cameron and Osborne, which everybody hates. And there's a secondary point which is less fundamental, but I think is still really significant and doesn't get taken account of it in all of this, which is, look, the Keir Starmer leadership expelled or persuaded to leave the Labour Party, about 300,000 people within the space of about 3 years. And they thought that would be fine, because what happened to the Labour right over the course of the late 90s and up to into the 2010s is lots and lots of people who were on the left the Labour Party. A few people who were more on the right, more centrist, joined it. And they ended up in a situation by about 2010 where the membership was very small, but was the most right-wing it had ever been, and was actually happy to nominate David Miliband to be the leader. But that took place over a period of about 15 years. It took place under completely different historic circumstances. And very importantly, it took place under conditions where Tony Blair was perceived to have had broad democratic legitimacy. He did what he said he was going to do when he became leader, and he also consulted the members on some key issues as he went along. As we all know, Starmer didn't do any of that. Starmer's genius plan, cooked up by Morgan McSweeney, was to simply lie to the Labour membership, complete about everything he was going to do, and then expel everybody who complained about it. And you can't alienate the 300,000 most politically engaged people in Britain in an age of social media and not pay a price for it. Because that's 300,000 people of the most politically engaged people in the country who've got friends and neighbours and family and social media accounts. And in all cases, that's dozens of people, dozens of those people you referred to earlier, James, who are not that engaged in politics. But what they know is, well, this friend or neighbour or family member of mine who used to be really into the Labour Party, they hate Keir Starmer now. That's a bit weird. And that's absolutely contributed to the ambient sense of antipathy towards them, and it's something that I think they really don't understand. They really don't understand, I think. But I think that's a big part of the story as well.
Sienna, what do you make of the policy side of that? Just in terms of how people in the parliamentary party think about how they're governing the country. There's been a quote on my mind way back from the sort of initial wave of European austerity, which was a line delivered by Jean-Claude Juncker, who will be remembered by some listeners to this show anyway, as one of the architects of European austerity. And he said, regarding austerity, of course, we know what we need to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And that's a view from the right about the difficulty of imposing the sort of policy that they wanted. And it's been on my mind, regarding the Labour Party, because I think, in some respects, as Jeremy's just outlined, the sense that there is a need for a very, very sharp and very strong break is pretty clear. I think it's hard to deny. But there seems to be some sense that I don't know whether there's stakeholder interest or whether it's just a sort of acquired inertia on the part of government, that they're very, very reluctant to take very, very bold action.
I think, one of the most significant things about Keir Starmer is that he very much shines up to this "the country isn't broken" narrative. I thought when Tom McTague interviewed him, that was the kind of... There was not a lot, actually, that surprised me, but the fact that he's just so frank in kind of saying that and rejecting that idea is so significant to me. I think it does reflect the views of so many Labour MPs. The kind of vast majority of the PLP will say, you ask them what's wrong with the country and what should we do to fix it. It's, the NHS could do with some more money is basically what it boils down to, their answer. Now, the Blue Labour kind of contingent of this and Morgan McSweeney's instincts sometimes run against this, in that he and Paul Ovenden, his kind of sidekick, who was in Number 10 until recently, they're more likely to say the country is broken and we need radical change. But of course, their solutions are more kind of reform aligned in some ways. Although on the economy, that's kind of more complicated. Some of them emphasise the kind of renationalisation and reindustrialisation more than others. But I think that's a kind of key thing. I mean, I think all of that is why they're so confused about how to approach things and how to sell things. I think the digital ID policy was a really good illustration of that. They finally took on the policy that Labour MPs, including kind of red wall, blue Labour-y types, were pushing for digital ID. But they sold it as a kind of solution to the immigration problems, first of all. Whereas the MPs who are advocating for it wanted it to be sold as a kind of way to fix the broken state and the broken country, and a kind of real piece of infrastructure that would permeate every arm of the state. And I mean, that's just, they don't get that because they don't agree with that kind of perspective on what needs to be done and what's broken. I think a lot of the time, if you ask people in the party, you know, why is it not having an impact, the fact that the government's doing all these good things? A lot of people in government blame the grid. That's their number one thing to go to. We need to get rid of the grid. So they obviously point to comms, and they are working on some kind of overhaul of Whitehall kind of communications, integrating all the departments and going more digital with their comms and all that sort of thing. And then the second thing they'll say is, well, it takes time for good things to feed through. And people will realise in the next 3 years, hopefully, that we've done all these great things. Obviously, in the meantime, people are just very, very angry. And Keir Starmer he vacillates so much that basically he pleases nobody. And he doesn't have the kind of charm to overcome that deep flaw. So just like in the kind of Labour Party itself, he has no natural base in the country. He has no real allies. Those who can relate to him, i.e. other kind of, I don't know, civil servants, you know, North London dinner parties, all those sort of stereotypes, they hate the blue Labour stuff, for example. But that's what because Morgan McSweeney chose him as the guy to win back the Labour Party, that's what he went with for a while. Now we're sort of heading in the other direction, but Shabana Mahmood is still Home Secretary, while Lord Hermer is AG. I mean, none of it makes any sense. So they're pissing everyone off at the same time. And it all stems from Keir Starmer's personal view, which is the country isn't truly broken and he has no real kind of policy direction to go in because of that.
It says something structural about the relationship between factions in the Labour Party, that you have this sort of vacillating, largely empty centre, which, looking around for some sort of ideological coherence, looks to its right, to the kind of blue Labour faction, which has a kind of very powerful, if not always completely coherent, but very powerful sense of what it wants to thinks has gone wrong, basically everything since 1945, and wants to change. It's less inclined to look to its left, and that leaves people like Jeremy seeing things very clearly about the Labour Party, but often with sort of no political or ideological influence over those sort of rather the vacuous decision makers at its centre. Jeremy.
Yeah, well, I think that's completely right. I think it's always important to think about the political sociology here, the question of, well, what social groups are we actually talking about, and what sets of interests do they represent? And that's what Sienna's already pointed us to, with talking about civil servants and the North London dinner party set. Because I was having a conversation just this morning with some friends who, again, not massively engaged in politics, about notions of disruption and stability, and how the rhetoric of disruption gets used across the corporate sector, actually. And I ended up saying in that conversation to them, saying, well, I mean, everybody has something they want to keep the same, and everybody has something they want to be different, except for the liberal technocrats. Liberal technocrats are the only group in society right now who basically just want everything to stay pretty much as it is. But that's not just. I mean, it's not just people literally working in the civil service or living in North London. It's a kind of broad managerial class. I mean, it's very senior managers at the top of universities, in the corporate sector, in some cases at the top of local government. And it's that network of people which entirely has produced most of the PLP. It's produced Starmer's faction in the Labour Party, but also most of the blue Labour people. Actually, most of them actually come from there. They have a sort of fantasised view about what the rest of the country is like, but that's not really where most of them come from. But to the extent that they want anything really to change, it's to the extent they don't come from that group. And so they do. They represent a set of interests which really doesn't want anything to radically change. So they would be happy to see some tweaks to the tax system, to public spending, to the public sector, they'd be happy for nurses to get paid a bit more. They'd be happy to pay a little bit more tax themselves for public sector reform. But they fundamentally don't want anything to really change because they're the people who've benefited absolutely the most from the way things have been being done for the past 20 to 40 years. So, and this is the nature of ideology. It's the nature of ideology that a lot of the time, unless you make a determined effort to do so, it's very hard to see outside of your own material interests. So for the most part, most of them aren't. They're not consciously thinking, "Oh, I'd better keep doing this stuff because otherwise those bastards are going to come and take all my stuff from me." They're just thinking, well, what's everybody complaining? What's everybody moaning about? Like, there's actually things are basically fine, and we just need the right people in charge and to keep plugging away. And because if that is your world, that is your worldview. If you have the worldview of someone who's been earning six figures for the past 15 years, has probably paid off their mortgage already, has enough in the bank to get their kids set up in a flat somewhere in London, and their kids only go to elite universities, everything's fine for you. And that's the people we're talking about. But ultimately, I mean, one reason I think what isn't going to happen, and I think the thing that a lot of sort of Labour Party members, to be honest, like with the best will in the world, can't get their heads around, what isn't going to happen is that bunch of people suddenly wake up one morning and say, "Oh, we better radically change everything because everybody wants us to, and this is all broken." Because the implications of that would be to undermine the system which has worked so well for them. So they're not going to. And I think that's the best way of understanding why they're clinging on to this way of doing things, despite the fact that objectively it's really not working. That's why I think it's often a mistake for people to try to judge why are politicians doing the things they're doing simply with reference to the question of what would be the best thing for their party. I mean, obviously right now, if you wanted to save the Labour Party, I mean, you probably would make Clive Lewis the leader of it. Like, if that's what you actually wanted to do. But that's not the primary aim of them. I mean, they would quite like to save the Labour Party, but not if it means fundamentally risking their positions now and also risking the significant salaries they intend to earn as consultants as soon as they leave Parliament. So they're not going to change, I don't think. And from that point of view, it's not very surprising. But that leaves significant problems for the rest of us.
You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. Stay with us and we'll be back after this very short break. This is On Politics on the LRB podcast. I am James Butler and I'm talking with Sienna Rodgers and Jeremy Gilbert about the Charybdis-like void at the heart of British politics, the leader of the Labour Party. I suppose it's worth saying that there's a consistent feature of Labour ideology, and it's something that runs certainly across its centre and to much of its left, which is the idea that good is when the state puts more money into things, and bad is when it stops doing that, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's something I realised years and years ago in sort of when I was sort of around the soft left of Labour and I was having meetings with Labour ministers. It's true that their conception of their project as the Labour Party is exactly as you've just described. And I spent years thinking about how can they be so dumb? How can they not understand? There's more to it than the question of we believe in an active state and a bit of public spending, and our evil enemies don't believe in that. And I eventually came to the conclusion, I'm really interested to know what Sienna thinks about this, is that basically it's because they think of themselves still in terms of the arguments they had with Tories when they were at Oxford. And the Tories they met at Oxford are like wild-eyed, like libertarians who really would like close down the National Health Service if they got the chance. And that's who they think they're up against. So that's what they think makes them the good guys, basically. And if they're up against anything more complicated than that, then they don't have any intellectual tools with which to conceptualise it.
Yeah, this is really what I was getting at when I was saying about Labour MPs, like kind of their politics boils down to, fund the NHS a bit more. I think it's why they're so confused in recent years about what direction to go in and what their offer is because largely they've kind of got what they want already. There is lots of state spending and we do have quite an active state. So where to go from there? Why when they've already got what they want and we're pouring lots of money into the NHS and spending lots on welfare and all the rest of it and pensions stuff, why is it all so shit? It's like, where does that leave them? They're not sure.
I mean, one question that I guess is worth asking, I mean, Jeremy, you've been talking a bit about the sort of the makeup of the Labour Party, the sort of sociology, the political sociology of both the party and its voters. I'm very fond of the very old sociological concept, in fact, derived from studying social democratic parties, of the iron law of oligarchy, which is that in institutions like parties, like political parties, an oligarchy grows up which seeks to reproduce itself. That's a pretty easy observation to make. It's something that you can really see happening in the Labour Party. And I wonder whether it's just the case that has reached so advanced a point that the kind of people you look at the candidate it fielded for Gorton and Denton, right? She seemed a perfectly nice woman in her own right, with some nice ideas about being good to people, but she was a corporate lobbyist, successful corporate lobbyist, had advocated for all sorts of kind of public-private partnerships of the kind that people generally are less fond of these days. But the party structure tends to select, not universally, but tends to select for obedience, not too much individual critical thought, and inculcates a kind of habit of like really quite unpleasant political intrigue. And is it the case that syndrome is now so advanced in the party that there's very little point in trying to do anything about it, that really the only solution to it is to let it fall over?
Yeah, I think, it's very difficult to argue against the idea of the iron law of oligarchy if you look at the history of the Labour Party. I mean, it's worth observing, of course, that the particular faction who now control the Labour Party really ended up engaging in all sorts of measures which seem to be, they're not even normal by the standards of a historically oligarchical, bureaucratic, inner sort of organisation. I mean, they simply lied to people, and they simply broke, by their own definition, on their own terms, they broke in with any norms of natural justice in the measures they took to intervene in candidate selections, for example, to make sure that literally hundreds of local candidates who looked a lot like Hannah Spencer weren't selected, and instead, people, corporate lobbyists were selected. So, but I think there is a really good argument. Yeah, it might be that, one thinks of Thomas Jefferson saying every country should have a revolution. I can't remember what the period was, like every 100 years or something. And you think about the traditions within the communist tradition of trying to understand, how socialist states become bureaucratically ossified, and how you need some kind of a big change, like every generation or two, if that's not going to happen. And you have to say, it might well be the case. Yeah, it might well be the case, and it might well be the case that we're going to look back on this year from the future and say, the moment when they blocked Andy Burnham from becoming leader is the moment when it became categorically clear that the interests of that ossified bureaucracy and the interests of the Labour Party as such had become completely incompatible. And they took a decision, the consequences of which was going to be to hand over to the Green Party the role of being like the dominant party on the left of British politics, rather than give up their own bureaucratic control of the Labour Party and its institutions. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's too apocalyptic. Maybe something else will happen this year. The other possibility neither of us talked about, actually, which I think is a genuine possibility, is also that the level of panic in the PLP after the May local elections will be such that the PLP will demand Andy Burnham be brought in, actually. And that could happen, and that could change everything yet again. And we could be here a year later saying, remember when everybody thought the Greens were going to replace Labour? Like, that was funny, wasn't it? So that's all possible. But it's also perfectly possible that indeed that they demonstrated with that strategically catastrophic decision that the iron law of oligarchy and the fact that iron law of oligarchy is usually ultimately sort of fatal for democratic institutions after a century or so has played itself out. That might well be the case.
I mean, on Burnham, I think that might underestimate just the depth of hatred that people have towards Andy Burnham in too many kind of parts of the PLP. I do keep thinking Burnham probably kind of had a lucky escape in lots of ways, not only because Starmer's job is hard and awful, but because if he did then trigger a mayoral election that then Labour lost to, say, the Greens, obviously that's an even bigger kind of challenge for them, but then it would reflect badly on him. And I think there was just all kind of dangerous moments there for him. But in terms of like the Labour selection process being ill-suited for producing people who are capable of governing the country, I think that raises all kinds of questions about how Parliament and the executive works, the fact that obviously they're integrated, and what people want their MPs to be. So this is not to kind of say that like factional stitch-ups of all selections are a good thing at all, but they probably are somewhat inevitable, whoever's in power. And what do we want our MPs to be? I think people are very confused about this question. I mean, some people, it seems like the public as well. I mean, I don't like arguments that blame the public for these things, but they do want a competent government and people who have some kind of independence of thought, some authority, some expertise. A lot of the time people will be, surprised that cabinet members have no backgrounds in the briefs they're given, etc. But at the same time, they want MPs to be normal people and kind of uber caseworkers, and they're expected to get through copious amounts of casework. As a former parliamentary caseworker myself, it's a real bee in my bonnet. And it's kind of a completely impossible job. And how do you select people for all of these various attributes? Is it actually possible? I mean, a lot of the time, Labour MPs are being selected to be lobby fodder, yes, but is that always wrong? Because you do need hundreds of them, if you've got a large majority, to basically be lobby fodder. I mean, you do want them to have interesting things to say about their own private members' bills that they want to push through, and kind of amendments that will contribute to the process and all that sort of thing. But do you want them to be in Parliament or in their constituency, for example? All of these kind of questions, I think, need a little bit more reflection. We had a really interesting debate, actually, in the House magazine via op-eds between Chris Hinchliffe and I think it was Neil Duncan Jordan, those two rebels, and Luke Akehurst, on the other hand, of like, why have they been selected to be Labour MPs? What is the point of them? What is their role? And Akehurst is very open in saying his role is to walk through the right lobby. That's what he thinks his job is. And obviously the rebels just don't share that perspective. And a lot of them came into Parliament thinking their role as an MP was something completely different to what it actually is in the end.
This is a really interesting question, I think, and it touches on, in some ways a much wider question, which is about reform of the electoral system as a whole. Obviously, that's been on the minds of some MPs in Labour, looking at the emergence, probably really for the first time in a long time, of a very plausible threat to the left of the party. It's hard to see, as plausible an electoral threat, I think, in the post-war past. At the same time, I think lots of what you're saying is inarguably correct. But one of the problems here is that we don't have a functioning local government anymore, right? Lots of these issues that end up on caseworkers' desks should be dealt with at a local level by a council that actually has some money to spend and some power to act. Now, for various reasons, local government has been hollowed out, and at various levels. It's a long and complicated story. But I think it's hard to disagree that the expectations placed on MPs are both contradictory and excessive, right? I mean, it's just completely implausible. Other systems have a mix between people who are responsible to constituencies and candidates who are list candidates and therefore are free of those obligations and can act in a different political way. All of these are possibilities that are open to the British state if anyone ever considered actually reforming it, but that doesn't seem to be on the agenda anywhere. Jem, what do you think of that? I mean, I know you've been an advocate for electoral reform in the past. Doomed enterprise in Britain?
No, I've always thought it will eventually come, inevitably. Like, some circumstance will emerge which will lead to it. And given that now, all the polls indicate a clear majority of people want it, I think some kind of electoral reform will happen eventually, probably within my lifetime. Whether it will happen soon, I don't know. I do think it's plausible, not probable, but plausible, that this Labour government, whoever is leading it, as we get closer to the next election, ultimately decides to implement some kind of electoral reform, because they will be looking at a situation where they're going to lose half their MPs, whatever happens. And ultimately, it will look less humiliating to lose them to this within this new system, this sort of clean slate, than just simply getting defeated by the Greens in 200 constituencies. So I think that's plausible. I'm not saying I think that's likely. I'm just saying I can imagine it happening in a way I couldn't have imagined it happening previously. But, you know, in all probability, you know, it's probably going to have to be a situation forced on a government by some hung parliament, like either the next one or three ones down the line. But there's absolutely no question there are all kinds of problems that simply can't be resolved without proportional representation. I mean, as I'm always saying, look, proportional representation wouldn't solve hardly a single problem in Britain, basically. But it's nonetheless, it's a sine qua non. You know, you can't get anywhere with this electoral system. But of course, I've been arguing that since like the early 90s. So, you know, it's nice lots of people agree with it now.
It would mean a real break, wouldn't it, with like a way of Labour Party thinking, which is, you know, it's common across the party that like the thing you have to do is all stick together so you can reach the commanding heights of power and then do what you want to do. And that, you know, that's not a doctrine I can see the Labour Party departing from anytime soon, at least until sort of reality smacks it around the head.
No, well, not unless it's forced into it. But I think, it's always been the case that in a more proportional European-style system, the natural role for Labour would be still to be like one of the major, or maybe the major political force on the left, but probably with like 100 to 200 MPs representing the trade unions and public sector, basically. That's the kind of organic role that the political sociology of Britain should offer to the Labour Party. And it's one that, you know, it could play as part of a coalition of forces that would include Liberal Democrats and Nationalists and Greens. And I mean, personally, that's what I've always wanted it to do. So, and I think that might well be what it's forced into after the next election. I mean, you know, referring to Burnham again, I think everything. I think what Sienna said about Burnham is true. I do think I would put money on Burnham being leader in the next Parliament, but I think he'll be leading about 80 to 150 MPs in the next Parliament, probably. Obviously, nothing is definite, and everything could change. But I think that's probably where what Labour is going to be forced into, and under those circumstances, we might get PR. I think your point about local government is really important. I keep saying to people, look, I work in the university sector, and even I think local government is a disaster. You know, it's the only sector that is in a worse state than universities. It's a total disaster for Britain. And the whole thing is the whole crisis in local government is about to go into a whole new historic phase, because we're about to see, both from the left and the right, we're about to see a whole thousands and thousands of councillors elected on the basis of what was basically a protest vote against the national government, not really, but on local issues at all. And they're about to find out what the people they're going to replace already know, which is they don't have the power to do any of the stuff that they'd like to do, or to fix anything they want to fix. And where that is all going to go, I really don't know. I really don't know where that's going to go. It's going to be chaotic. It's going to be a mess. And how it's going to end up impacting finally on the next general election is extremely unpredictable.
I just want to look forward a bit. I mean, with the rest of this year, I mean, obviously we've talked about the May elections, which are, as you say, Jeremy, likely to be a catastrophe. I mean, not likely. They are going to be a catastrophe, and there's just no way that they're going to be good for Labour. They'll go backwards in Scotland. They'll lose Wales. They may even lose London. Probably not the mayoralty, but many London councils. There's a trickle of Mandelson documents that are likely to be released. That will keep that story front and centre. It's Labour panicking, allowed to pass a Conservative motion in Parliament, which removed control of those documents from the Labour Party. It's a very, very unwise thing to have allowed to happen. But so that's going to keep those stories very live, as will whatever happens with Andrew Windsor, I think we have to call him now. Saxe Coburg Gotha, maybe. The very possibility of a protracted Middle East war, as we said at the top, probably wipes out any kind of recovery. We just don't know what's happening there, but it's not good. Put it that way. we can see another inflationary cycle, cost of living issues come back front and centre in the national conversation. And then who knows? I mean, England is a very kind of unpredictable place in the summer these days. Last year, there were some very, very unpleasant race riots. It's absolutely not impossible that those happen again this year. So if you're a government staring down the barrel of that year, I mean, what do you do? I mean, it's not that I'm sympathetic, but I do think it's a problem. Everything we've talked about seems almost inadequate to how severe the issue is. I mean, Sienna, do you have any insight on what they're thinking they might pull out of the hat in the course of the next year?
I think, that's giving them a lot of credit. The May elections, it's going to be an absolute mauling. Just to note that the London mayoralty isn't up this year. Then there's the Mandelson files. I mean, as I said earlier, war in the Middle East is, in kind of crude, horrible way of looking at it, good for Keir Starmer staying in number 10. And then there's the kind of, in terms of English, race riots, that sort of re-emerging, that again is seen by Starmer allies as one of the things that he's strongest on. It's, when he was addressing the country from number 10 behind the podium and, taking that very kind of serious, I'm a lawyer, I've run the DPP, I know what I'm doing here, kind of stance, that's again seen as advantageous for him. But in terms of the actual political balance, the revolt led by both Reform and the Greens, I can't see how any of that gets better at kind of in the foreseeable future. I mean, everyone's going to be, whether it's Starmer or someone else replacing him, they will weather the consequences and just keep taking beatings, I think, from the electorate, whether, he's deposed or not. It's going to be incredibly painful. I suppose if you were, those are the kind of Starmer optimism, reasons for optimism, but I suppose if you're anti-Starmer, the reasons for optimism are May is an absolute disaster to the point where it does actually kind of shift the atmosphere towards there needs to be an alternate leader, and then you might get someone, whether it's Wes Streeting or Rayner or whoever else, who has something about them, at least one element that is better than Keir's current performance, even whether that's just, comms and being able to speak like a normal person, or whether it's having a clearer political direction. All of them would improve on one element.
I mean, they do have the option of time, don't they? I mean, I suppose that's the thing. There's not going to be a general election. However much people sort of whine and complain, it's not for a good long while yet. The forlorn hope in some ways is that something might happen, something might turn up between now and 2029 at the latest. And
the other thing is that with the May elections and local elections, Reform gaining more councils, the constant refrain in the Labour Party is, this will expose Reform as being incompetent and they won't be able to change things, and people will see them, see through their kind of true colours, and people will point to the Greens in Brighton and say, look, they were kind of shown up there. So I think that's the kind of one of the things they will hold on to. I think that probably overestimates how much people understand the division of responsibilities, going back to that casework point of who's responsible for what. It's not made clearer by the fact that, MPs in marginal seats will pick up any bit of casework, whether it's about your bins or not. So I think people will be relying on that in the Labour Party. I don't think they're necessarily right to do so, particularly because I don't think it works for Reform in the way that it does the Greens, because no one has thought, at least until now, that the Greens have been a possibility for national government, whereas with Reform it's they may not be able to do much on a council level, but when they get into government and actually radically change everything, that's a kind of opportunity that can't be compared with just being in kind of running a local council, where you still have that layer of governance above you that you can blame.
they're pretty open about it, right? I mean, one of the things Reform says is like, look, it's a mess. We're doing the best we can, but we're learning about how bad it all is, and that's not our fault. Now, that's the thing that just isn't open to Labour as a strategy. Jeremy, I have a related question for you, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that question as well. This week or just a few days ago, we saw some numbers from YouGov, which gave us a sort of sorpasso moment with the Green Party polling higher than Labour. I think those numbers are soft. They're post-by-election happiness. Lots of risks there for the Green Party of sort of falling in love with themselves in that sort of euphoric early sort of Corbyn-style moment. But if you zoom out, isn't it the case that maybe this is an expression of something that has been happening in this country since at least 2008, that there is, a significant political faction that wants really quite significant change from the left, and it's bounced around trying to find these avenues of expressions. Some of those people were out protesting against austerity in the 2010s. They're people who maybe, like Zach Polanski, were inclined to sort of, Liberal Democrat or something, and they found themselves radicalised by circumstance pretty strongly. Some of those people got involved in Corbynism, and I think that the numbers attracted to that sort of verdict or that position have increased massively. So is there a continuity to be seen there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. I mean, I would say it's a point I was making in commentary I was writing like decades ago, actually, on open democracy, or sometimes in The Guardian. If you looked at the kind of hard psephology, if you like, if you look at things like the British Social Attitude Survey, it was always clear that there was about a quarter of the electorate who, they might not use the term themselves, but were socialists, like not even just social democrats, really. Like if you said to them, do you want like a complete transition to some totally different way of organising socioeconomic relationships along socialistic lines? They say yes, like that's what they wanted. And part of one of the key historical features of British politics from the late 80s through to the 2010s was that those people didn't have any representation. They were not represented in the media, they were not represented in politics. And it came as a genuine shock to lots of people in 2015 when it was the Corbyn leadership election that really manifested just how many of those people there were, like in the country. And lots of people, I remember hearing this a lot of the time, both from people who were pro-Corbyn and people like Luke Akers, being very sincere, actually. They were genuinely shocked. If you'd asked them about how many of those people do you think they are, their estimate would have been 3 to 4% of the electorate. They were shocked to realise there were so many of them. And then 2017 showed that those people were capable of forming a bloc with a slightly more centrist constituency and getting like over 40% of the vote. And all of that was supposed to be impossible. I think, as we all know, the whole kind of Starmerite project has been tied up with a kind of media and establishment project to pretend that 2017 was this sort of weird anomaly. It's now clear that it wasn't. That's what the current situation demonstrates. It clearly wasn't an anomaly. And exactly as you've been describing, there's a good quarter of the electorate who really do want a clear socialist programme, and they're not going to accept just being unrepresented. They're not going to accept a situation where they don't have any political representation. And there's if you move from left to right, the next 25% of the electorate, it's not at all clear they can't be persuaded to go along with what that more radical 25% want. If every other option is like Nigel Farage or continuity centrism. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot of continuity there. Yeah, there's been a kind of series of attempts by that political constituency to find some sort of expression for itself. And I think the thing we're all processing now is the extent to which, the Green Party hasn't really put up any resistance to allowing itself to become the vehicle for those people. They've gone along with it collectively, and to the extent that the Green Party is now able to represent itself as that constituency's political representatives, I think their 25% might not be that soft. I think it's. I think it might well be, for all the reasons you gave. It might well be really soft, but it might not be if you just look at things like I keep saying, like the British Social Attitude surveys that say, well, how many people have always really held a set of positions which lined up more with the Greens than with Labour or with any other party, and wouldn't vote Green because it seems strategically pointless. So and that's partly why, that is why I think probably what's happened just over the past few weeks is pretty seismic, because it's not actually a new situation. It's also not a new situation that there were lots and lots of people who would answer the question in opinion polls, which party do you actually think represents your views, rather than what is the one you're going to vote for, and would say the Greens. So that was a thing for a long time. Lots of people basically thought, I would vote Green if I thought the Greens could win. That's not even a new situation. So in many ways, this has been building up for a long time. And I think your analysis is completely right there, I think.
Sienna, does that mean that it is time for the Labour Party to take Zach Polanski seriously? And what would that look like?
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because Labour MPs are just so divided. It's not as if all Labour MPs secretly agree with Zach Polanski, and therefore it's just a question of taking him seriously. So many fundamentally disagree with him. But when we're talking about leadership questions, it's like, but there are more than 80 who do secretly agree with Zach Polanski, if we're talking in those kind of crude, broad terms, and therefore are enough to trigger a leadership change. It's just the same kind of broad party, broad church kind of conundrum, isn't it? I mean, clearly, what they need to be taking seriously is they need to choose a path. They either go full throttle, Shabana Mahmood, if they really think that the kind of blue Labour prescription of being left on the economy and right on social issues is where the country really is, where most people are, then they go full on for that. Or, they do go in the kind of Polanski, Burnham direction, full kind of soft left, electoral reform, being much looser with the whip, on immigration, on welfare, and all these things. They go in that direction. They need to make some kind of choice. So what they're doing at the moment is pleasing absolutely nobody. That's what I'd say.
So if Keir Starmer were to leave, certainly some of his successors would have stood with him. I mean, all of them would have stood on the Labour manifesto in the last general election, but certainly some of them would represent a really significant departure from what was agreed in that manifesto, what was promised in that manifesto. And so I guess the question is, where does legitimacy lie for a prime minister? Is it from what is formally the case, right? So someone who has the confidence of the House of Commons to formally lead a government, that person is prime minister. Or is there something else at work here, some sort of rather vaguer sense of there being a sort of popular element to this, that there has to be a kind of a sense that there's a contract with the people who put them into power, and that you can lose legitimacy by departing from that? Does that make sense?
Well, I think I think the whole question as to like, in what way, by what processes, do contemporary elected governments acquire or maintain any kind of democratic legitimacy is a really fraught question. And I think really any sense that they do really have democratic legitimacy, or they govern according to norms of democratic legitimacy, has been declining for decades. I think it's been declining since the 70s. It was already the case with the new Labour government that despite the fact that what they did basically what they said they would do in their manifesto and their party conference had voted for, it was clear that most people who voted Labour when they elected Tony Blair thought they were voting for an end to Thatcherism. They thought they were voting for a restoration of social democracy, which they didn't get. I mean, to a large extent, the same is true of the people who voted for Thatcher, who thought they were getting some sort of return to 1950s Britain. They weren't really voting for the deregulation of the city, which is what the whole project was leading up to, and its various consequences. But clearly we've seen a kind of acceleration of those processes with the high turnover of Tory prime ministers, with Boris Johnson effectively, becoming leader without a general election, then expelling a section of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, and really just announcing that the Tory party was no longer a broad church of one nation Tories, Thatcherites, and proto-reform people. It was basically a version of reform, of UKIP. And then one of the things that's really striking about the Starmer project has been that, they completely and very flagrantly and explicitly sort of did away with any notion of democratic legitimacy within the Labour Party. I mean, they're just sort of openly contemptuous of that idea. And they are now stuck with a situation where it's kind of weird, actually, but they do obviously see themselves as somehow bound by the manifesto in ways which is quite hard to understand. But I feel like there isn't really an answer to the question, like how do prime ministers get legitimacy? How do governments get legitimacy? They get it through a complex sort of assemblage of sometimes doing what they said they were doing in a manifesto, sometimes doing what the public obviously wants, sometimes convincing the public that what they're doing is the only thing that they can do, that what's needed. And this is all symptomatic of a much more general crisis. It's a much more general crisis of representative democracy, which we've been living through since the 70s, whereby certainly compared to the period from, say, the 30s to the 70s, what governments do has more, in Britain, it's particularly has more to do with what the American government wants, what the city wants, what various corporate interests want, than what the public wants. Any section of the public, whether it's the section that voted for them or not. Of course, coming back to the question of the electoral system, we've got this particularly distorting factor in British politics that governments will do what they think transactional floating voters in marginal constituencies want, as opposed to what anybody else wants. And they're very much focused on those voters. And that obviously creates a massive and absolutely justified sense of disenfranchisement, like across the rest of the public, across the rest of the electorate, to the point where I think those sorts of traditional questions like, well, shouldn't you hold a general election if you've just become prime minister to secure a mandate, sort of don't really occur to people, because people's wider sense of overall like perpetual disenfranchisement is so intense that they don't really care about that. They just want a government that does some of the stuff they want them to do, like by any means necessary, which is a dangerous situation for us to be in.
I think all of this it's another question that gets to this whole first past the post being kind of bursting at the seams sort of question, where, I mean, I think, the kind of where do they get legitimacy? And the manifesto, obviously it's worth noting that there is, the Salisbury Convention, so the Lords have to respect manifesto policies. And I think when you deviate from that, it's just technically procedurally difficult to get things through. So when the government has gone for things like winter fuel allowance changes, digital ID, assisted dying, those kind of projects are complicated by that fact that the Lords can kind of do whatever they want in that case. So I think subtracting from the manifesto, i.e. like not delivering on what you've promised, is quite easy, but adding to it is hard as long as it costs money or it's a big kind of controversial social change. I mean, that's part of the reason why changing your leader does embed inaction and why the Tories suffered so much from, Rishi Sunak. Lots of people still think that he could have had quite a successful premiership as long as, he didn't come at the time that he did. I mean, that's arguable, but I think it's also why Labour has struggled to govern so much. They were so constrained in their manifesto. Really, they were doomed from the moment that they allowed themselves to be boxed in by the Tories on tax. I think everyone kind of acknowledges that, but it was the price to pay, they thought, for winning the election. Actually, this is a good time for my hot take on the biggest failure of Morgan McSweeney, which I don't think I've ever written down before. But from a kind of Labour Starmerite perspective, I actually kind of think that his biggest failure in some ways was his biggest success in the election, i.e. getting those kind of that stretch target of MPs, those kind of what they now refer to as bonus MPs, the ones who didn't expect to get in. Because if you they had slimmed down their majority by about 80 MPs, they'd be finding all of this a lot more easy to actually govern with this Parliamentary Labour Party. And he shouldn't have spread them so thin because it's stored up all kinds of trouble for them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you're staring down, your 400 vote majority and thinking, well, I'm probably out whichever way it goes next time, what incentive do I have to follow what my leader says? Jeremy, Sienna, thank you so much for joining me and guiding us through the various pains and problems and penalties facing the Labour Party. We mentioned, of course, Trump's war on Iran largely in a domestic context. But if you navigate to your podcast feed right now, you can hear an episode of the LRB podcast helmed by Adam Schatz devoted to that catastrophe and its consequences. It is also covered by Tom Stevenson in the latest issue of the London Review of Books, alongside pieces on the venal and grasping House of York by Andrew O'Hagan, Nicholas Spice on Schubert, Sheila Fitzpatrick on thinking during the Soviet collapse, and much, much more. It's out now. Thanks for listening.